Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the concluding topic of Week 3 for our World Civilizations 1 class. Today, we're going to be looking at primarily Assyria and Persia. We'll also do a very quick rundown of some other Afro-Eurasian societies once the age of empires started to begin for the first time in world history. Now, again, as always, we'll start off by looking at the key terms you need to keep in mind for today. First, we'll be discussing empire, because of course you can't really talk about an age of empire without knowing what an empire is. We'll look at the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We'll look at their concept of the land of Ashur versus the land under the yoke of Ashur. We'll look at the Persian Empire, and we'll look at one of their most successful leaders, Darius the First. So, of course, your upcoming assignments are pretty much the same as they were for the last PowerPoint. Please do keep in mind that your first content quiz is coming up this Friday, October the 2nd, and you also have your final essay thesis statement due the next Friday at both at 5 p.m. Keep in mind, once again, for this final essay thesis statement, all the details for this assignment can be found in the final essay prompt in your final essay section on Blackboard, but please do let me know if you have any other questions about this assignment. In the meantime, let's look at empires for a second. Using one of my favorite movies of all time, The Empire Strikes Back, as inspiration. Most historians and archaeologists agree that starting around roughly 1250 BCE, some civilizations began to form into the very first empires. Now, what exactly is an empire, and what is the purpose of an empire? Give you a second to think on it, another awkward pause. Right, yes. As many of you probably know, imaginary class who's hopefully watching this at home, an empire is where one country or one territorial state, as we've been looking at, starts to take over a bunch of other territorial states in their vicinity or even farther away, as we'll look at later, in order to set up a larger empire. So essentially you have the mother country or the father country that starts the empire. They take over a bunch of other surrounding countries and basically make them serve under them, essentially. Now, the purpose of an empire, as you might imagine, is typically to grow power and influence, but perhaps most importantly, to gain resources. For example, look at some of the groups we talked about last time, the Babylonians and the Middle Kingdom. One of the first things they would always do when they set up these territorial states is they demand tribute in some form from the people they control. So when an empire conquers other countries, they draw from their resources and their wealth as well. So essentially, as you grow and expand, you gain more resources, more trade routes, all sorts of things to help your society grow. That, of course, leads us in some of the advantages of creating an empire, because once you have an empire, you can grow all these resources much more rapidly. You have access to more land, more labor, more technology, all sorts of great things. However, what might be some of the problems with these empires? Maybe even again using Star Wars as inspiration. Right, yes, again, as you might imagine, the problems with these empires are usually fairly simple. Once you start to take over these countries, a lot of times they don't react well to being exploited. A lot of times the exploitation can be very harsh, tends to lead to rebellions. So a lot of times as these empires grow, they further conflict as you try to take over places and prevent rebellions. For example, as the Galactic Empire tried to spread across the galaxy in Star Wars, their exploitation and brutal practices led to the Galactic Alliance, which led to a great series of movies, but that is neither here nor there. By the way, just in case anyone was wondering, I'm not a fan of the new Disney movies. Just thought I'd throw that out there. But anyway, some of the first empires, and to get into a little bit more specifically about what started them. Historians have come up with 4 major factors that led to the rise of these first empires. One, again, climate change. From about 12,000 BCE on, there was another major global drought that led to many similar issues as the last one. Low river levels, people are having to move their civilizations, and major dust storms all across the world. This, of course, led to migrations once again. Now, to review a little bit, what happened the last time we discussed migrations that made people move across the world? What happened as a result? All right. Yes, again, very good, imaginary class. As people start to migrate, they bring in new resources and technology and cultures, which causes these civilizations to grow and change. Specifically this time, many of these groups were invaders who brought along these chariots and other weapons we talked about last time to take over these capitals of the old civilizations to cause more decline. Technological innovation also helped as well. Pack camels were used for the first time, which allowed for longer transportation across terrain. Why would that be so beneficial for, say, Egypt, for example? Remember the geography of Egypt that we talked about in the second week. Oh yes, very good, imaginary class. Since many of these civilizations started in river basins that are surrounded by desert, now you no longer had to rely on just the river for transportation. You could also travel across land as well, which made it much easier to trade and expand by land as well as by river. Shipbuilding was also improved. You now had better masts, sails, ballast, rigging, all sorts of things that led for more improved sea travel. This again means you no longer have to rely on just the river for travel. People can now spread their civilizations and trade across oceans even. Finally, ironworking improved weapons and agricultural tools, so it was easier to fight each other, and your farming techniques were more reliable. Finally, you had administrative innovations, massive militaries for the first time, established roads and relay stations, deportations, and forced tribute. We already talked a little bit about why forced tribute was so important. That helped serve the purpose of gaining economic growth for an empire. But why in particular would these roads and relay stations be so beneficial to growing an empire? Very good, imaginary class. Reliable communication and reliable transportation. You can't have a very large territorial state and control a lot of geography if you don't have a way to communicate and travel across it. Otherwise, how are you supposed to know what's going on? And people could just set up their own government at any time they wanted. Now, one of the first empires in all of recorded history is known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which lasted from about 911 BCE to 612 BCE. This imperial system was split up into two structures. I want you to pay especially close attention to this, because we're going to contrast it with what the Persian Empire was like in just a second. This empire was, like I said, was split into two sections. First, you have the land of Ashur, which was considered to be some of the central cities of Assyria. You've got Ashur and Nineveh, for example, which were in the interior of the empire, provided agricultural products, soldiers, and politicians for the king and their state god, Ashur, which again explains why this is called the land of Ashur. Outside, you had the land under the yoke of Ashur. These were outside territories of non-citizens, primarily conquered peoples, who gave gold and silver tribute to the empire, as well as forced labor. Now, what would maybe be the pros and cons of a system like this? This is a very segregated and fairly oppressive system. As I stroke my beard like a James Bond villain. But yes, as you can probably see here, one of the main benefits, again, goes back to the overall purpose of an empire. If you have these people under the yoke of Ashur, you have a guaranteed access to the things you need in order to grow your empire. You have constant monetary and resource tribute and labor systems in order to build all these magnificent palaces as you see here. This, for example, is the royal palace of the Assyrian Empire, much of which would have been built by some sort of forced or slave labor. Now, however, and also, something important to keep in mind is why would this system be beneficial for the people living in the land of Ashur? Now, to give you an idea of this, maybe think about how you would feel as a citizen living in the land of Ashur. Awkward pause again. Yeah, you might feel pretty loyal to this system and be willing to support it. So that's why a lot of times you'll see these strict divides in these imperial systems. You have the people on the interior who heavily benefit from the system, so it ensures you're going to have some dedicated, loyal citizens. Then, of course, like I said, you have these people on the yoke who are, excuse me. That's awkward, I almost had to sneeze. It'll probably sneak up when I least expect it. But anyway, then you have these people on the exterior who are basically used as forced labor. They provide the heavier tribute, which essentially can make these people feel more loyal and superior. Naturally, as you might imagine for the cons of this system, a lot of times these people under the yoke of Ashur or under the yoke of your empire aren't really going to stay loyal. However, to get a little bit more in depth about their other benefits or advancements, the Assyrian military was also very powerful for its time. For the first time, they started using a combined infantry, cavalry, chariot, and siege weapon military. And, perhaps more importantly, for the first time you had a large year-round military force instead of just conscripts or random recruits. This was supplied by some of their, again, people under the yoke of Ashur. You had Phoenicians, Israelites, and people from Medes in Greece. Why would this be such a great system? All right, and to give you a comparison, for those of you who are more aware of American history, what were some of the American Army's problems in the Revolution with not having a standing military? All right, again, very good imaginary students. Having a year-long military force ensures you're going to have more trained professionals and not just random volunteers who don't really know what they're doing. When you have a year-long force, you can train them, give them benefits to encourage their military service, and all sorts of other things to inspire their loyalty. This gives you a professional fighting force which can get more accomplished than just people who are recruited from farming or pot making or whatever it is. To compare to the Revolutionary War, one of the main problems George Washington had is the army was not year-round for much of the Revolution. Therefore, whenever it came to winter, a lot of soldiers would desert and go home in order to make sure their family had enough food to survive. So that made it very difficult for Washington in the early years of the Revolution. The Assyrians solved this problem with a year-round military. To give you a little bit more idea about their ideology as well, they believed that their god, like I said, Ashur, and the king were the only ones who could keep cosmic chaos at bay. Which again, how does this belief system help an empire? Exactly, again, imaginary audience, it inspires loyalty into the king. If you genuinely believe in this religious system and believe that your king is the only one who can protect you, you're going to be much more loyal. They would support this idea with massive state architecture, texts and literature that praise the king's achievements, and artistic depictions, such as this one here, of successful Assyrian military campaigns. Now, this is of course called propaganda. Can anyone tell me a bit about what propaganda is? Yes, very good, imaginary students. Propaganda is, of course, when the state puts out a big, massive media campaign to once again inspire loyalty and inspire action on the citizens. So again, it's not only for the first time. Not only are you just using your connection to the gods to get people to stay loyal, the state now has the resources to make basically a massive advertising campaign, spouting out all these great things that demonstrate the power of the state to ensure people's loyalty. A little bit about the social hierarchy as well. We'll go through this relatively quickly. But of course, like I said, you had the king at the top. He was the sole agent of Ashur, so this gave him authority. The military elites were heavily rewarded through gold, silver, and massive estates throughout the empire. Why would you want to keep them on your side? Right, yes, again, that one is also probably fairly obvious. If you're able to keep these military elites loyal, you don't have to worry about a military rebellion. The peasantry and slaves were closer to the bottom. They would be owned by the elites and or the king, but they were still allowed to marry, do business transactions, and own property. In contrast, slaves of conquest were given no real rights when they were once forced into labor on state architectural projects. So this again shows the significance of that divide between people who are under the yoke of Ashur and people who are in the land of Ashur. Even these bottom peasants and slaves in the hierarchy were still treated better off than those who were captured and under the yoke of Ashur. So again, you inspire the loyalty of the people on the interior by separating them from those who don't have the same rights. Also, women, as with many of these empires, again, were not treated particularly well throughout most of the Assyrian Empire. The inheritance still went through the male line, their interactions outside the home were restricted, and they were forced to wear a veil outside of their home to symbolize their purity. Now, the Assyrian Empire did ultimately collapse because of their constant need to spread their armies out over a vast territory. At the time, they did spread all the way from modern-day Persia down to Egypt. However, again, because of their mistreatment with those under the land of the yoke of Ashur, they were eventually defeated by a combined force of Greeks and Babylonians in 612 BCE. Because again, when you continuously expand, you're going to make enemies of your neighbors, and the whole land under the yoke of Ashur concept very much irritated those who were under the yoke, in this case, particularly the Greeks. Now, one thing I'd like you to look at a little bit on your own time is a bit about Ashurbanipal's palace. I probably butchered that pronunciation. Please excuse me. But this was a great palace built in the city of Nineveh that was the center of the Assyrian Empire. So once you watch this video, I want you to think about a few various ways this palace was used as propaganda. Now, in the meantime, we'll go ahead and look at the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was founded in 560 and lasted until about 331 BCE. This empire replaced the Neo-Babylonian rule of Nebuchadnezzar, who, as you may know from biblical history, is credited as having conquered Judah, created the Hanging Gardens of Babylon here, and is a prominent figure in the book of Daniel. The Persian Empire was very dominant throughout Southwest Asia, largely due to Cyrus the Great. He is credited as being the one who unified the Persian tribes, took over many gold mines to advance the wealth of the kingdom, and also conquered Greek city-states along the Aegean coast. Those of you who are big movie buffs can maybe tell me what this will eventually result in with the Persians taking over parts of the Greek coast. Yes, for those of you who've seen the terrible movies 300 and 300 Rise of an Empire, this leads to some of the many famous wars against the Persians with the Greeks that many ancient history fans are familiar with, such as the Battle of Marathon and the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, one reason I want to focus on the Persians is they had quite a different philosophy than the Assyrians. The Persian army is considered to be much more multicultural and gentler than the Assyrians were. Now, why might that be a particular benefit for this empire? Alright, yes, very good, those of you who were paying attention earlier. It essentially means you'll hopefully avoid the problem with the land under the yoke of Ashur. Instead of treating your subjects terribly and inspiring rebellion, the Persians take a gentler approach that might encourage loyalty. For example, Cyrus the Great, claimed when he conquered Babylon that the gods there had turned against the Babylonian king due to the king's defeat. Now, why do you think this method would be more useful in saying that the gods there didn't exist? Excuse me. Alright, to give you a point of comparison, think about if a conqueror came in and took over America. That's obviously going to already irritate us, but what if they then outlawed, for example, Christianity is the largest religion in this country still. How do you think most people in this country would react if they also outlawed Christianity? Very poorly, obviously, is the obvious answer. But what if they instead said that God had actually deserted our leaders because of their sin or whatever it might be, and had backed their cause instead? If they're able to convince people, that'll obviously inspire more loyalty, since many religious people are very deeply led by their convictions. So if you can convince people that their religion wants them to follow you, they're much more willing to do so. This was very effective for a lot of Persian history. Also, Cyrus is credited with having released Israeli Jews from captivity that they had been in under Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem in 538 BCE, roughly, which is, again, for biblical historians, is depicted in the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah. However, one of the most famous and well-loved of all Persian rulers was Darius I, who firmly established the new Persian system of government. He was militarily successful, and he ended many revolts and conquered all sorts of ethnic groups from Greece to the Nile River. However, he did treat all ethnic groups equally. The only thing you were required to do when you became a Persian citizen was to be loyal to the king and pay tribute. He established satrapies, also known as provinces, which were ruled by different governors and local officials who also used local languages. He also expanded roads and established a universal currency. Why might this be such an advantageous and useful system? All right, again, very good imaginary pause. Hopefully you're all pausing and answering these at home, but again, online class, what are you going to do? But in the meantime, again, treating people equally prevents society from becoming divided and turning against each other. All you have to do, if no matter who you are, is just pay tribute to the king and stay loyal. Also, his government system was pretty inclusive as well. Not only did he sometimes allow local governors and officials to rule over their own areas, they also used local languages, so they didn't try to erase local culture. To use America as an example again, imagine that a country came in and conquered us and tried to get us to stop speaking English. For those of you who've seen the debate on language in America in the past few years, you could probably guess that that wouldn't go very well either. So again, he also inspired loyalty by letting people keep aspects of their culture. Finally, these roads and universal currencies connected the empire effectively. Like I said at the very beginning, these roads allow frequent communication and frequent travel, which allow you to rule over this vast empire. And having a universal currency means it's very easy to buy and trade across the empire. For example, I don't know if any of you have done this recently, but I actually a year or so ago was able to be on one of the last cruise ships that got to go to Cuba. When we went through customs, we had to spend about 30 or 45 minutes switching over our currency to Cuban currency. Very big hassle. So once you have a universal currency, you don't have to worry about that. You can just buy and trade with anyone across the empire, just like you would with anyone else. A little bit about their religion. It is worth mentioning that they created a religion called Zoroastrianism, which was named after Zoroaster, who formalized their tribal religions. They believed in Ahura Mazda, who was their creator god and symbol of all good. He was opposed by Ahriman, who was the deceitful and wicked opponent of Ahura. Kings were believed to have been appointed by Ahura Mazda in order to be the top of the strict social hierarchy and protect the people. Again, using your ties to the gods in order to inspire loyalty. Finally, there were some important architectural achievements that were worth mentioning. One of the most significant and one of the great wonders of the ancient world is the ancient road, which, as you can see here, portions of it can still be seen today. The Royal Road is about 1,600 miles long and reached all the way to southwestern Iran. Like we mentioned earlier, this allows the empire to stay connected, allows for trade, diplomacy, military movements, all sorts of things you need in order to keep an empire together. Darius also oversaw the Great Canal, which connected the Red Sea and the Nile River. Anybody geography or architectural fans know what a canal is. As I stroke my beard like a James Bond villain again. But yes, very good imaginary students. A canal is something that cuts through a small piece of land, which can connect large bodies of water together and allow you to sail straight through. So again, this is all about connecting the empire and making trade more efficient. Instead of having to sail all the way around the world to get somewhere, you can take a huge shortcut, essentially. So again, religion and architecture was also pretty impressive across Persia. Now, we'll talk about Persia a little bit more in the coming weeks, but I want to wrap things up by just talking about a few of the societies who are considered to be on the fringe of these empires who we haven't looked at much yet. The Greeks existed mainly in a city-state system around this time. We'll talk about a little bit about why they did so later. From 499 to 490 BCE, as I alluded to earlier, the Greek city-states revolted against Persia. By 490, Darius' invasion force had been defeated by the Athenians at the infamous Battle of Marathon. By 480, Xerxes defeated Leonidas and the Spartans at Thermopylae, but lost a naval battle at Salamis, which ultimately ended in their invasion. The Phoenicians, also known as the Purple People, kept dependence from Assyria by providing cedars and other luxuries to Mesopotamia and Egypt, essentially kept Assyria from running them over. They were known as great sailors and shipbuilders, and also created one of the first alphabets in the entire world. Finally, the Israeli state was formed sometime between 1200 and 930 BCE, and was officially established at Jerusalem, according to many historians, by King David, sometime between 1000 and 960 BCE. This kingdom was fragmented after the death of his son Solomon in 930 BCE, and emphasized its origin story with a liberation story from Egypt at the hands of Moses. Now again, we'll talk a little bit more about why some of this stuff is important as the class goes on, but please especially keep the Assyrian and Persian comparison in mind. In the meantime, I do want you to look a little bit about the historical Battle of Thermopylae. As you watch this, keep in mind some of the major differences between the actual battle and the movie, and think about what some major factors contributed to the outcome of the battle. So, essentially, that's all I have for you today. Please, again, keep these upcoming dates in mind, and let me know if you have any questions. Have a great rest of your week.